there are lots and lots of different milkweed species in North America. Here is a map from the Monarchs joint venture of some of the most common milkweed species in different areas throughout North America. In California, we have 7 common native ones. And there are, so there's lots of milkweed species that are native to North America, but not native to California, or native to California, but not native to Minnesota, or I think I just clicked on Wisconsin, not Minnesota, but anyway. So it's a genus of plants with a whole lot of different species in North America. And like I said, if you have any questions, so then milkweeds are not the only thing they eat, because monarch butterflies, like many insects, eat plants during 2 life stages. The caterpillars get so larval host, that's what you eat as a caterpillar, get all the publicity. In this case, for monarchs, well, actually, most butterflies are fairly specialized as caterpillars. They eat only 1 or a few different plant species. And in the case of monarchs, here's a monarch caterpillar eating a milkweed. They're fairly specialized, and what they do with those sugar is they grow from tiny larvae to big fat larvae that pupate and become adults. They also save some of that sugar. So about 25 years ago, Carol Boggs, who was a professor at Stanford, did a series of experiments, not for monarchs, but for butterflies in general, showing that they get, on average, about half the sugar they use for reproduction for their future eggs from what they eat as caterpillars, and about half from sugar they consume as adults. So the other thing butterflies consume is, as adults, here's a butterfly nectaring on something that's, a purple coneflower. I lived in Massachusetts for many years. That's why I'm still affiliated with Tufts. This was my garden in Massachusetts. And here is a monarch butterfly nectaring on purple coneflower. So they nectar on all kinds of different plants. Usually butterflies are very generalized as nectar feeders, collect nectar from lots of different plants, and nectar helps them live longer. It helps them have energy for flight, and it gives them about half the sugar they use for making eggs and future offspring. So we'll come back to that at the end of talking about monarchs and milkweed, just to remind you that milkweed is only about half of what they need in their life cycle. Their adult needs are just less specialized. So most of you have probably seen pictures of monarch butterflies throughout the life cycle, and Irene is laughing because I was debating whether or not to include this slide while chatting with her before you came in. But here is a monarch butterfly checking out a milkweed. She'll lay eggs on it that will hatch. And you can see these are 2 different species of milkweeds, right? One is not fuzzy and the other is fuzzy. I think this is showy milkweed and this is woolly pod milkweed. So here are some little caterpillars feeding during their first instar. They'll grow and get big. This one's eating heartleaf milkweed, another California species. And then eventually they wander away somewhere to pupate. Here's a monarch butterfly. Here's its pupa, making an interesting choice in the East Bay area for where to wander to. Oops. And then these will emerge as adults and start the, annual, well, not annual, but the generational life cycle over again. The annual life cycle of a monarch butterfly is more complicated than that because, as many of you know, they're famous for their continent-wide migration. And the most famous migration is what's shown on, so this is a graphic from the Xerces Society about monarchs in North America. And the most famous aspect of monarch butterfly biology is the eastern monarch migration. So these individuals overwinter in Mexico in forests that you might have heard about on the news. There's issues with logging in the forests and protection and logging owners versus conservationists. And every once in a while, people die trying to protect the forest. I remember when I was in high school, they first discovered these overwintering sites and learned about damage as a threat to monarch butterflies. So that would have been the 1980s. Anyway, and so after they overwinter in these groves in Mexico, they don't reproduce at all. They then fly north A first generation of monarch butterflies breeds on milkweeds in places like Texas and Louisiana and Oklahoma and maybe as far as Tennessee and the Carolinas and Virginia. And then the offspring of that first generation continue to expand northward over the course of 2 or 3 more generations. And at the end of those summer, at the end of the summer, the last generation of monarch butterflies flies all the way back down to Mexico, where they go into reproductive dormancy, shut down. They still fly around in nectar and live in these forests for the winter. So that is the famous monarch butterfly migration that gets all the press. Here in California, we're probably not seeing those butterflies. In California, monarch butterflies have a similar but smaller scale migratory life cycle. So monarch butterflies in California that are migratory overwinter at a series of little forests along the California coast. And then in spring, they spread into the Coast Range, Central Valley, maybe the Sierras. And then they continue breeding in the Central Valley and Coast Range throughout the summer, but their offspring, some of them stay and some of them move as far north as potentially southern Canada, here in British Columbia. We think of the Rocky Mountains as the divide between the eastern and western monarch butterflies. So the western monarch butterflies at the end of the summer don't fly to Mexico, they fly to the California coast. You might have seen them at the big displays at Pacific Grove or Natural Bridges in Santa Cruz or Pismo Beach. There's also small displays. I've been to the Albany Hill. Display is the wrong word. Places where you see lots of monarchs. Population almost every year since I've been here. And so that is the California migratory population, the western monarch butterflies. There's also a longstanding non-migratory population of monarch butterflies in Florida, where it's warm enough that they can breed year-round. And as some of you know, there have also been in Los Angeles and San Diego and Santa Barbara monarch butterflies breeding year-round and quite possibly not migrating since the 1970s at least. I think we just didn't know what was happening before then. So here in the West, monarch butterflies are in very serious decline, even more so than the big migratory population in the East. Overall, so every year, the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation organizes Western monarch counts, they call them now, but if you can see the top of my screen, it says Thanksgiving counts. And this is a graph of the number of monarch butterflies counted through time, estimated from data going back to 1980 from counts that researchers had done there less systematically, and then aligned with these annual Thanksgiving counts. On the x-axis is the years through time. On the y-axis is millions of butterflies on a log scale. So every 2 increments is 10 times more butterflies. So this is 10 million, 1 million, 100,000, 1,000, etc. And what you can see is that the 21st century has had about a 95% reduction in monarch butterflies since back when I was in high school in the 1980s. So we're not very sure how many there were in the 1980s. Oh, and again, if we were in person, I'd say how many of you have been to one of these overwintering groves, but they're really impressive. Here is a cypress tree with monarch butterflies in it, and they also overwinter in non-native eucalyptus, which is another topic for conversation. But if you go to one of these places where they're overwintering in a year where there are lots of monarchs, which used to be every year, but isn't so much anymore, it's just like you think the trees are full of leaves, and actually they're just monarchs overwintering. It's one of the most spectacular phenomena you will ever see. And if you haven't been out to the coast to see that, it's really impressive. And hopefully we'll have a lot of monarch butterflies next year. Here's a graph I put together a few years ago of, back in the 1980s, there were millions of monarch butterflies. We're not really sure if there was 1 million or 10 million because we didn't have systematic counting, but there were a lot. You would go into the forest and the monarch butterflies would be everywhere. I just updated this with the past 2 years of data. Then in the 21st century, for most of it, we had about 200,000 monarch butterflies, which isn't millions, but you would still go to the groves and see a really impressive display. And then about the time I moved to California, there was a big drop in the abundance of monarch butterflies on the coast. There was a year when there were only 2 years in a row, 2018 and 2019, when there were only 30,000 monarch butterflies counted. There were only about 2,000 counted in 2020, and that's we have no reason to believe that's because people weren't out counting. This estimate accounts for which sites were visited. Probably more people were out counting butterflies because we didn't have that much to do. The monarch butterflies reappeared for 3 years, and then they were back down to like 7,000 butterflies this past year. So there's a lot of reason to be concerned about conservation of migratory monarch butterflies, and especially if you live somewhere a little bit inland like me in Davis, we want to see them and want to conserve them. And I want to acknowledge Cheryl Schultz, a colleague of mine at Washington State University, who sort of brought me in to study Western monarch butterflies, and the Xerxes Society and Mia Monroe. Mia Farrow's an actress. Mia Monroe, if any of you have met her, I think she's from Marin County, who initiated the Western monarch counts. So that's our Western migratory or monarch butterflies, but there are also non-migratory monarch butterflies throughout the world. Monarch butterflies don't just live in North America. We think actually North America is where monarch butterflies originated, but they have since colonized lots of places throughout the world. Here's a map from a book by Anurag Agrawal, a professor at Cornell who studied monarchs throughout his career. And, all the places I've circled are non-migratory monarch populations. Monarch butterflies in Florida and Cuba don't migrate. Monarch butterflies have colonized Hawaii. We think they got out there by themselves somehow, and they don't migrate on Hawaii. Monarch butterflies have colonized Australia. Occasionally, they're known to migrate up and down this east coast of Australia, but they don't migrate like they do here. They've colonized Morocco and Spain, and they don't migrate there. In Central and South America, there are monarch butterflies that don't migrate. So, and it seems like the San Francisco Bay Area, at least the East and South Bay, might now be places where monarch butterflies live and don't migrate. And so just to zoom in on California and the Western monarch butterfly range, here is a map of, again, the Western monarch migration is these sort of outward bound arrows, which is about as far as they get in the first couple generations. They then occupy this whole range. They come back and fall. They stay on these overwintering sites shown on the coast. And then these orange sites are areas where resident monarchs occur year-round without migrating. As I mentioned before, they've been in the LA, San Diego area for at least 50 years, but the San Francisco Bay Area population is relatively new. So here's a graph that David James, another ecologist at Washington State University, put together. He's also worked on Western monarchs for a long time. This is the number of monarch sightings reported on iNaturalist through time, starting to go way up in 2019 and 2020. iNat usage has also gone up, so we did kind of this fancy statistical index, Cheryl Schultz and I, that tried to account for sampling effort, but we also see this, here's time from 2010 to 2019, and our sort of urban population index. We're now estimating there's about 12,000 monarch butterflies living on the California coast in cities year-round. That is nothing compared to the millions or hundreds of thousands that used to overwinter on the coast, but it's an interesting and new phenomenon, and perhaps it's natural to wonder whether the declines of the migratory populations and the increase in the resident populations are somehow connected. So the reason monarch butterflies can stay Oh, I hope that wasn't blocking you. There was something on my screen. But the reason monarch butterflies can live anywhere year-round is the presence of evergreen milkweeds. So milkweeds that don't die back in winter, but keep green leaves above ground throughout the year. The most famous of these is tropical milkweed, Asclepias curassavica, this beautiful horticulturally popular plant here. It's not native to North America, but it is native to South and Central America. Also, the other evergreen milkweed that is common in the Bay Area is Gomphocarpus, this balloon milkweed, which has these funky seed pods and is also actively used by monarch butterflies and green throughout the year. It's a different genus, even according to most people, and it's native to Africa. So when these plants are present and it's warm enough, monarch butterflies don't need to migrate and can breed year-round. So, there have been a number of concerns about this phenomenon, and maybe it's a little bit just because it's not the way things used to be in the past. But one thing we know is that non-migratory monarchs have high levels of a protozoan parasite, Ophriocistis electroscira. Everyone calls it OE. And this parasite causes monarchs, instead of looking like their usual beautiful cells, to emerge deformed and sometimes die. I will say from our experience working with monarchs in the lab here, it seems like only a small fraction of even the heavily infected monarchs look this bad. Some of them kind of look like this, and you have to test them for the parasite to know if they're there. This last panel is some data from Dara Satterfield, who I'll talk about a little bit more later. She was a PhD student at University of Georgia studying monarchs and migration in OE. And she came out to California about 10 years ago and looked at the proportion of heavily infected monarch butterflies in the sites with year-round breeding in Southern California. And it was like about 75% of them had this disease. And then she looked at them in the migratory population, and it was only about, 5 to 15% who had the disease. We've actually known this for longer than the past 10 years about disease and migration. Oh, but I meant to say that I think it was this kind of observation that led many people to ban tropical milkweed in particular. And I always wonder why they didn't also ban Gomphocarpus, but the balloon milkweed. But for whatever reason, tropical milkweed gets the bad rap, maybe because it's so popular horticulturally. So tropical milkweed, in response, I think mostly to concerns about this OE, has been banned as a, potential milkweed that's harmful to monarch butterflies. And that's a lot of what's inspired my interest in this. So, but we've known that non-migratory monarch populations build up high levels of OE for many years. This is Sonia Altizer, who's about my age, in her 50s, and who I've known since the 1990s. This was her PhD dissertation work published 25 years ago. She was the sort of first one to document that migratory monarch butterflies have lower levels of this protozoan parasite OE than non-migratory populations. So here are data she compiled in collaboration with Lincoln Brower, who studied monarchs forever, and her advisor, Karen Oberhauser, who's still active in the monarch community. And you can see the eastern migratory population, the one that does that big migration, has extremely low levels of OE. The western migratory population in her data was a little bit higher than her student, 15 years later got, about 25%. And the Florida resident population was again 75 or 80% infected with OE. So we know that non-migratory populations have lots of OE. Let me see if I made a slide for this. I'm not sure I made a slide for this. So why do non-migratory populations have high levels of OE? Well, there are at least two reasons. One reason is because one reason is because the migration itself, the ones that are heavily infected can't survive it. So monarch butterflies that are heavily infected die during migration or can't migrate at all and die because winter comes. That means that at the population level, they're not there to transmit it to other monarch butterflies. And so overall, there's a lower level of OE in the population. That's one of the big reasons why it's less prevalent. The second reason, which maybe has gotten more press in California, is because these evergreen milkweeds build up spores on their leaves. And the main transmission route of this OE infection is that an infected monarch butterfly lays eggs on the leaves. She rubs off her spores. The young caterpillars eat the spores while they're starting to feed early on, and that transmits the disease. It can also be transmitted by the father in a more complicated way. They have these spermatophores that are nutrition packs they give when they mate to their partner that provides some of the nutrients for the yolk and the eggs, and apparently there's some transmission through these spermatophores. But the main transmission pathway is this eating the leaves. If the plant doesn't die back, it can build up potentially higher levels of OE on its leaves. So there's these two reasons why the non-migratory ones have higher levels of OE. So one question that we asked is whether heavily infected monarch butterfly populations can persist. How do we get these, high levels of the disease persisting? Is it all fed by the migratory population? And so what I did is this is the nerdiest slide in the talk. Well, maybe it's all nerdy, but I channeled my middle school self and gave myself an algebra problem of taking data. Some of these are even from Sonia Altizer's dissertation 25 years ago about how OE affects monarch butterflies. So here is the daily probability of survival of adult monarch butterflies. And so they have about 85% chance of surviving. They live several weeks if they're healthy. They only live a couple weeks if they're infected. And there's much more variation. There's ones that are infected and look like the one in the picture that die right away. And there's ones that are infected that aren't symptomatic at all. They also, if they're infected and they live, produce fewer eggs per day. So a healthy adult monarch with lots of nectar and lots of places to lay her eggs can lay 25 or almost 20 to 25 eggs a day on milkweed. And if she lives for like a month, she's laying hundreds of eggs. But the infected ones only lay about, the ones that survive only lay about 10 eggs a day. The egg to adult survival is slightly higher in the healthy monarchs than the infected monarchs. And if you multiply out how many baby monarchs you get that survive per adult monarch, you get something called a per generation population growth rate, where if this value is 1, the monarch butterflies are exactly replacing themselves with one offspring monarch butterfly. And if it's bigger than 1, the population would grow per generation. And so healthy monarch butterflies could increase threefold in abundance per generation, even in real landscapes. And infected ones only increase about 10% per generation, but that's enough to get by. So probably yes, these infected populations can persist on their own. You have more butterflies dying, but enough living for the population to persist. I also did another step in this, which is I took data from this guy, David James, who has this really cool program. I'm talking way more than I thought I would. He has this really cool program where he is working with a prison in Washington to have women rear monarch butterflies and release them to join the migration. So he's done this mark recapture study of how many are resighted here on the California coast in winter. And if we take his data and estimate their survival during migration, then most of them don't make it back to the, migration is a hard thing. Flying from Pullman, Washington to the California coast, even flying from Davis to the California coast is a hard thing for a little butterfly. So if we add back in the survival costs of migration, the migratory monarchs are just barely making it too, which makes sense because we're concerned about their conservation. And as an evolutionary ecologist, this is a little bit surprising that the cost of migration is almost as high as the cost of infection, but maybe not too surprising because we've had both migratory and non-migratory monarch butterflies coexisting for a long time. So my detour into nerdiness is that the effects of this OE parasite on the non-migratory monarchs are much more conspicuous than the monarchs that don't survive during migration, but they're maybe not that much worse. So non-migratory monarchs have high levels of this protozoan parasite OE. This is true, but heavily infected monarch butterfly populations can still persist. So if we want to have this, what I'm leading to is what do we want as a future for the East Bay and South Bay? And if we want to have it, this population can persist on tropical milkweed and balloon plant. One reason we might not want to have it is that there are also concerns that milkweed near overwintering sites pulls monarchs out of the migratory population. And this concern comes from work that was done on eastern monarchs by Sonia Altizer. I think I said she's a professor in Georgia now, and her grad students, Dara, who we met briefly, with her data from California, mostly worked down in Texas, not too far from Georgia. Georgia's up here somewhere. But anyway, and what she was looking at is, and these pink dots are areas where monarch butterflies migrate. These blue dots are, I think, the Houston metropolitan area, if I remember my Texas geography, where there are resident gardens with tropical milkweed, just like we have in California. And what Dara spent a lot of time doing is showing that you could pick up a signal. So these little circles tell you how many residents in blue and migrants in black she's seeing there. And in the Houston area, in the fall when monarchs are migrating, she sees migratory monarchs coming through and interacting with the resident ones. And so I probably put way too many graphs on this slide. This graph shows her estimate as the fall goes on of this pulse of migrants coming through the year-round breeding sites. This graph shows that when the migrants come through, you have this sudden emergence of uninfected monarch butterflies, presumably from the migrant population. So in October, before they come, it's about 80% infected. Interestingly, her estimate in December after they come through was 100% infected. I'm not sure why that increased. But anyway, so it looks like monarch butterflies come through these, areas with tropical milkweed and at least partly interact with the resident butterflies. And then Anya Majewska, another PhD student of Sonia's working in the East, did an experiment where she said, if we take these monarch butterflies that are starting their migration and expose them to milkweed, either swamp milkweed or tropical milkweed, swamp milkweed is an eastern native milkweed, what do? Well, a significant number of them, about 15% more than you would usually see, start dropping out of their dormancy and having reproductive behavior like they want to stop migrating and hang around and reproduce. So some fraction of monarch butterflies, if they're migrating and encounter a fresh milkweed, whether it's native or tropical, will drop out of the migration and reproduce. At least that's what these data suggest. So we wanted to know whether this is also what's happening in the East Bay. And so we tried to emulate these surveys of going through. So this is Berkeley, or El Cerrito, Berkeley, and Oakland. We did monthly field surveys. Emily did almost all of this, monthly surveys, looking at front yards along this route. She recorded adults. She measured them for OE infection. We also counted milkweed and caterpillars, but I don't have those data here, right? Well, I have them, but I knew I was going to run out of time if I showed them to you. I'm already talking a lot. And then we also did supplemental field surveys in 2023. We took 2024 off to write papers and make sense of it, but it was interesting enough that we've restarted. So we're walking through 4 of these neighborhoods every month this year too, if any of you live there. I can show you which routes we are doing. So, and we wanted to find out, do we see this signal of a pulse of uninfected monarchs showing up in the fall during the migration that might be what's actually supporting this East Bay population at the cost of the migratory one? So here's, the second most nerdy part of the talk is a graph of what we saw from our surveys And first, I'll show you what we expected to see if monarch butterflies were stopping off. Then, what we'd see is an increase during fall migration, maybe a small increase in the spring when monarchs are leaving their groves. And we might see something like this, where in fall, this is the number of monarch butterflies seen. Here would be an increase in fall, maybe a little increase in spring, a decline during summer when there's no migratory monarchs to support it. What we actually see is not that at all. During the fall, what we see is the number of adults is going down. And during the spring, not much change at all. The time when our monarch butterflies grow is during the summer, which is when the climate is best for monarch butterflies, when there are more flowers flowering for nectar in people's yards, and when people have native milkweeds have milkweeds up. That's when our monarch butterfly population grows. So this suggests it's growing of its own accord and then declining during winter when it's colder and kind of just doing its own thing. We also looked, so no, the numbers decreased during migration. They certainly didn't go up. We also looked at whether we saw a pulse of uninfection, the infection going down during migration. So if there were these uninfected migrants showing up in the fall, we'd expect the OE infection to decrease during fall migration, maybe to decrease again in spring when the monarchs are leaving the groves, and then to increase in the summer when the population's not getting that input. But that's not what we saw. What we saw was that OE was increasing in the fall, and then it was lowest during the summer, or sort of lowest in May, and then started to increase again. And one nerdy thing is that in theoretical ecology, well, it's not that nerdy. After the COVID-19 pandemic, we all know about the dynamics of disease transmission. You have a large population of uninfected people, the disease comes, it increases. Similarly, you have a large population of monarch butterflies in summer, the disease increases. The population of monarchs falls, the disease lags behind it and falls. So it's more consistent with what you'd expect if the population just had its own cycles of the disease in our gardens, rather than having something external driving it. So no, we didn't see the signal we expected, which was a big drop during migration. Okay, and then the other thing is that this is what happened during our second year of monitoring. 2022 was a very warm spring. 2023 was sort of a more typically cold spring. So in 2022, we saw more adult monarchs and eggs and larvae, and a higher number of infected ones in the cold year when the population was low. Maybe there was less transmission, but for whatever reason, OE was much lower in the second year of our study. And this, more than anything else, made me want to keep monitoring again and see exactly what's going on with this disease in our gardens. So this interaction between the migratory and the resident monarch seems to be much weaker in the East Bay than it is in Texas, which there's so many ways in which the East Bay is different than Texas that maybe it's not surprising that monarch butterflies are a little bit different too. So, maybe some of you came here to find out if tropical milkweed is good or bad for monarch butterflies. And I hate to be the scientist who says we need to do more research, but the answer really is, in this case, it depends. Because it depends partly on whether your goal is having, migratory monarch butterflies at the expense of all other monarch butterflies, including seeing ones in your garden. Because surely if we remove tropical milkweed, we will not see as many monarch butterflies in our garden in the East and South Bay area. Like, that's why they're there. It also depends on whether you're concerned about individual monarch butterflies that are diseased versus population persistence and sort of culling them through migration. Certainly, I was corresponding with one scientist who is very concerned just about the individual monarchs dying of OE. And I was like, yes, some die of OE in gardens, but as many, it's anyway, at a population level, we have as many monarchs, or at least as high a replacement rate. So it depends on what your goal are. Do you want to have, yeah, okay, I don't need to say more. And there's also just lots of other costs and benefits. There is a possibility that having tropical milkweed and balloon plant milkweed in our garden increases encounters of migrants with OE. There's also a possibility that monarch butterflies, a few of them do settle there in spring, especially. And, you know, the monarch butterflies are kind of raggedy and wimpy after a whole year of overwintering on the coast. And if they can settle down right away, lay eggs, and have offspring who are young and healthy, that might actually kickstart the migration. And that's a radical and undocumented view among scientists. But a slightly less radical view is that we need lots of milkweed in the Coast Range in early spring to kickstart the monarch migration. And it's not that big a jump from native milkweeds in the Coast Range to whatever milkweed you can get in your yard in Contra Costa or Alameda counties. And, I personally tend to fall on the side in favor of at least allowing people to have tropical milkweed if they want it, because there are also a lot of benefits of increasing public awareness of monarch butterflies. I think I'm not a social scientist, but my reading of the social science literature is that people who encounter monarch butterflies in their gardens are more likely to care about migratory monarch conservation, not less likely, oh, the problem solved, I see them in my garden. That interacting with wildlife of any sort, including butterflies, encourages your interest in conservation. And so, I can't, nobody knows whether removing tropical milkweed will help or harm monarch butterflies. I think, anyway, but that doesn't mean we don't know how to help monarch butterflies. So if we set this issue aside, there are lots of things we know are good for monarchs. And I just want to end with that because there are lots of things we can encourage people to do. We know that native milkweeds are good for monarchs. We know that gardens with diverse nectar plant species are good for monarchs. That will fuel them to move around and find the milkweed that's there to get from the coasts to the Coast Range. And it also increases their fecundity, their egg production through their life cycle. We also know that minimizing the use of all kinds of pesticides, not just insecticides, but herbicides and fungicides, is good for monarch butterflies. Pesticides are in so many places in our environment that if you want to help monarchs, I know that sometimes use of them is unavoidable for some people, but using as little as possible is one of the best things we can do for monarchs. And then there are a few common sense things you can do to minimize this parasite if you are a gardener. One is people have advised to cut back evergreen milkweeds, and I don't see a reason not to do that. I mean, as a gardener, you like to prune things anyway. The time of year when you do it, I think, isn't that important. People at first were saying cut them back in fall because then the migrating ones won't see them and won't be tempted to oviposit there, to lay their eggs there. That might be true, but could also be any time of year when you don't see monarch butterflies using them might be a handy time to cut them back, and that will get rid of the buildup of the OE spores. And one more thing, which is also lightly controversial with some home gardeners, is that if you can avoid or minimize rearing monarch butterfly caterpillars indoors, another big route of transmission of OE in home gardens is people bring all the monarchs inside and are feeding them all the same milkweed plants, and the spores get transmitted by less than ideal care. And we were rearing them for research one year, and one of our milkweed plants had been infected and we didn't know it, and we ended up having to euthanize a lot of monarchs that we were going to use in research. So it's I'm not criticizing you as a rearer of monarchs. Just if you can avoid doing that, that is one of the ways that the disease gets transmitted. So that's what I prepared to talk to you about. It took about 15 minutes longer than I expected, but if you have questions, I'm happy to stay around as long as you want to stay.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I have one question, and then if anyone else has any questions, please raise your hand. You were talking about cutting back the milkweed when the monarchs are not using it. So I mean, obviously, if you see caterpillars on it, don't cut it down. Um, can you describe what the monarch egg looks like?
Oh, I didn't put in a picture of an egg.
Oh,
It
no
is
worries.
a little tiny pale yellow cylinder. Um, we could Google after we're here and find
Sure.
one, but it is a little tiny pale yellow cylinder. That's very distinctive and characteristic. Um, What I will say is that many, many eggs get eaten. I wonder if I have various backup slides here and I could look for an egg picture, but I'm not sure I have one here. Many, many eggs get eaten. So if a monarch has made it to being a caterpillar, it's much more important to not cut down the plant than than
Okay.
if it's still an egg. So we see spiders eating eggs, we see wasps eating eggs and caterpillars. Um, but yeah, so it's a flat leaf and it's a little tiny yellow cylinder. And if it falls off the leaf easily, it's not a monarch egg. So you can shake it a little bit and see if it is. Thanks for that. Sorry, I forgot to do
So
that.
your bottom line, I guess, advice to us when we're talking to people, because there's different, um, I guess, viewpoints and everything out there. When we're like at a tabling event and people ask us about milkweed, um, what would be your, I guess, what should we say? Should we say,
Yeah.
yeah,
So my advice would be that planting milkweed for monarchs is a good thing. And
okay,
if a person is confused by anything more than that, I would stop there. If a person wants more information, then I would say probably the best thing to do is to plant native milkweeds. And the native milkweeds that would be likely to grow in your area are especially narrowleaf milkweed. If you're a little bit further up in the hills, you could look into woolly milkweed or showy milkweed, but look for milkweeds native to California, not just native to other places. Um, so someone who's a little bit more advanced, I would start talking about native milkweed. My experience, and you all are master gardeners, so native milkweed is cool to have. My experience talking to homeowners in Berkeley and Oakland is that they've been told, oops, bumblebees are also active year round. I don't know why I'm shit. Anyway. Actually, this is true. Monarch butterflies are, sorry, I'm going off topic, but monarch butterflies are not unique. We irrigate gardens in California. We expand the growing season of plants. And one thing we've started studying in my research group is other butterflies and bees that are native bees that are being affected by how we're changing the landscape in cities. And that's kind of why I said novel ecosystems when I was thinking of a title for this talk. Um, but anyway, so yes, so I would say, the guaranteed good advice is to plant native milkweeds. If you can't find them or are confused about what they are, don't worry too much. Plant milkweeds. And if you have an evergreen milkweed, then it's nice to cut it down sometime when you don't see big caterpillars on it. That is sort of the order in which I'd say things.
thank you. And Liz has a question.
Yes, I was curious, just out of interest, how your doctoral student wandering the streets of Berkeley would be able to tell the difference between a resident monarch and a migratory monarch. Is there some way that they know that?
So you can't tell without killing them. So
Uh,
we are only tracking how many monarchs there are, but we're not trying to necessarily separate a migratory monarch that's stopping in for an afternoon from a resident monarch that lives there year round. Because we decided we didn't want to sample enough to kill them at this moment in time. So what we were expecting if it was mostly migratory monarchs is that we'd see a pulse of them in the fall when the migration is coming through the Bay Area.
I see. So
And we didn't see
it's the time
that.
of year.
Mhm.
And then you didn't say exactly, maybe I missed it though, what the recent crash in population of monarchs is due to. Do scientists know?
We don't know.
Hmm.
We get every time the monarch butterfly population gets a higher or lower, because it's jumping up and down a lot these days, people ask us, and it's so hard to know what was different about one year from another year.
And my final question was about OE in native milkweed. Are we testing for that at all?
So I don't know anyone who is testing for OE on plants. We are doing, Sonia Altizer's lab group is continuing to do monitoring of OE and monarchs throughout the country. If you're interested, you can look at the University of Georgia webpage, and she has a kit that she'll send you to put a piece of tape on the belly of your monarch butterfly. So you have to pick it up very carefully, rub its abdomen with a piece of tape, and send the piece of tape to University of Georgia. So we continue to monitor it in monarchs, but it's hard to detect it on the plants. I will also say, in response to your question, there is a former UC Davis graduate student called Mika Friedman, who graduated just as I was moving here to California, who's now a professor in Toronto, who keeps doing research on monarch butterflies in California. And I think he's doing some sampling to try to get at the chemistry. So you can tell where a monarch was born because the chemical signature of tropical milkweed is different from the inland milkweeds. So you can kill them, take them to the lab, and analyze them chemically. And I think Mika is starting to do that. So in a few years, scientists in general will know the answer to how many of the monarchs in the Bay Area, we hope.
Thank you very much. Really, not nerdy at all, Professor. It was very enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to know, how did you select the sites to do the program in Berkeley and other areas in the Bay Area?
So I chose the first 4 of them, which were all in the sort of Berkeley, Albany, El Cerrito area. And I did it really haphazardly. I was here, before I moved here, I was here on sabbatical in 2019, 2020. Everything shut down. The monarch butterfly counts were really low. I was kind of depressed on Thanksgiving weekend. And so I decided on Friday morning to first go to Albany Hill and then start counting monarchs in gardens, because we'd been hearing reports on social media and things of monarchs in people's gardens. And so I just decided to walk up the hill, and that's how one of the routes formed. And then I kind of just looked at the map and arbitrarily picked about the first 5 routes. And then when I hired Emily Erickson, and I forgot to mention, after I'd been doing it a little bit, Google, Google search engine, Google, the giant mega corporation, wanted to invest that year in conservation. They have a big program for landscaping their own campuses. And they decided to give us a donation that allowed me to hire Emily for 2 years to do the surveys more formally. And so Emily had grown up in Oakland. She was finishing her PhD in Pennsylvania and had grown up in Oakland and wanted to move back. And so she sort of strategically chose routes to sample all the different neighborhoods of the East Bay area, as you know.
Because some years back, they kept telling us not to use the tropical milkweed. So I eliminated all that and just used the narrow leaf milkweed. And I haven't seen any monarchs for the last 3 years. And I live near Arden Woods, which I'm along that coast, that drive line where some might come, but I haven't seen them, because my goal has been to save them. I know how to cut the plant, put them in a jar with a net, and when they come to full growth, I release them back into the environment.
Yeah, so this is where it gets really tricky, because, and this is why conservation groups have started changing their messaging. I know that Xerxes Society has changed their messaging over the past few years, partly because we work very closely with them and have been talking to them about our findings. I don't know if it's made it to Monarch Joint Venture yet. They're a little bit further away geographically, and I don't work with them as closely. I know Monarch Joint Venture came through one of our neighborhoods in Oakland and was giving people these signs saying, get rid of your tropical milkweed. And some of the homeowners we work with didn't want to get rid of it. So we were like, tell them you're part of a study. And they did, and they kept it. And but anyway, so the tricky thing is that what those groups were trying to get was what they thought was the natural situation where monarch butterflies just were hardly breeding at all near the coast. And so in a weird way, they're trying to save the migratory population by getting rid of the monarch butterflies in your yard. And
Hmm.
that, for anyone living in the East or South Bay, is like, you don't want to get rid of the monarch butterflies in your yard.
So what is the botanical name for the milkweed that grows year round that you mentioned?
Well, the tropical milkweed,
Okay.
Asclepias corasavica, and also the balloon plant milkweed, Gomphocarpus.
So that was a year round species.
That's also a year-round species.
And they will come and lay their eggs on it, as far as you know.
Yes. Well, we see lots of eggs and caterpillars on the balloon plant on Gomphocarpus.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. We have time for one more question if anybody has anything, and then it is just about lunchtime. Okay, well, Elizabeth, thank you so much. I mean, that was so informative, and I'm with Liz. It was not too nerdy. I mean, some of us love nerdiness. We love charts, we love graphs. And if you have charts, graphs, and photos, even better.
Well, thank you all for your interest. I'm really happy to hear from people if you guys have questions. And Irene, I'm so glad you reached out to me after you saw our paper. It's been fun to get to know you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And as I said, the most of this presentation was recorded. I'm going to have a big sticky tape on my computer next time to make sure I start everything on time. So we'll share the recording. And so thank you, everybody. It's been educational and fun. Thanks so much.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.